Hey everybody, it's Callie, and today I want to talk about how OCD can be really deceptive, but maybe not just in the ways that you already think it's deceptive. So I think most of us are already aware of the usual ways that we think of OCD as deceptive. So maybe it can be the constant what if questions, anything ranging from what if I just hit a person with my car, to what if I've done something to offend God, to what if I'm not real, or some other existential thing. You can pick your flavor. You know, we're not picky here. We take all themes of OCD. So then what happens if your what if question becomes, well, what if I don't have OCD? And that's kind of what happened to me. And I think part of that question is OCD in itself. I think a lot of people have that question of, well, what if I don't have OCD? What if I'm dangerous? What if I have, some other mental illness that could make me hurt somebody or make me lose touch with myself or something like that? I think a lot of that is rooted in OCD, but there are other factors at play too. And for me personally, I think part of the issue was before I really knew what OCD was, I was going to doctors that also didn't really understand OCD. They didn't really recognize it as what it was. So I've told a story before about how I went to just a general practitioner once I started getting the symptoms that were really something I couldn't ignore anymore. They were really interfering with my daily life. And he basically said that I was probably schizophrenic. So of course that sent me down this spiral of, oh my God, what is, schizophrenia as far as what are these symptoms? What am I going to be dealing with? What is, going to be the rest of my life? What's that going to look like? And then as soon as I started looking into that, I'm like, I'm not schizophrenic. That's not what that is. That was a doctor who really didn't know what my symptoms were. And I think probably shouldn't really have been chiming in on that subject. He was telling me things that just weren't true. And unfortunately, that's not my only experience like that with a professional. I went to another doctor shortly after that, after I was spiraling. And I felt, even at that time, when I was really vulnerable, but I knew something that she was saying just didn't really fit me. It wasn't right. She was implying things that were more on par with something like manic depression. She was saying, oh, well, your highs are really high, and then you have, really low lows, and it's like a roller coaster like this, right? And I'm like, no, that doesn't sound like me. That really doesn't feel right. So just as like a PSA, I'd like to say, make sure that you're advocating for yourself. If you feel like something isn't right, if a doctor's telling you something that you're like, that really doesn't sound right, don't be afraid to speak up for yourself. Don't be afraid to say, hey, I really don't think that aligns with the symptoms that I'm having. Is there another way that we could look at this? So I think through all of those experiences, going from thinking that I had schizophrenia to thinking, well, maybe this doctor's right, maybe I am manic depressive, to saying, well, I know it feels like OCD, like a lot of the symptoms are there, but maybe it's not OCD because that was my OCD talking. I went through this whole cycle of being, well, you know what? Maybe I just have anxiety. Maybe I just have, quote, run-of-the-mill anxiety and depression. And of course, when I say run-of-the-mill, that is not to minimize any of the suffering that people with anxiety and depression go through. It's just to note that OCD is different, and the way that you go about treating OCD is different from the way that you would treat anxiety or depression. So even though I still had this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I'm like, well, I don't know, I have OCD, I think, but I don't know if it's OCD, I went through the treatment for anxiety and depression, which I think a lot of the times a lot of us find ourselves in talk therapy, which really isn't the way to go. I think with a lot of talk therapy, when you're looking for the root of anxiety, when you're looking for the root of your depression, when you are trying to tackle those things, when you have OCD, it's almost like you're giving meaning to these things when you really shouldn't be. So a lot of what we fear in OCD is kind of rooted in our biggest fears. Yeah, sure, like for me, I was afraid that I was dangerous. So of course I was afraid of hurting somebody through neglect, or whether I wanted to hurt somebody purposely or something like that. I had those fears, but they weren't rooted in anything that I had done in my past per se. So there wasn't really a thing that I was trying to just get to the core of. There shouldn't have been something like that. But in doing talk therapy, it's almost like I went about it that way. So it gave me something that I was looking for. I was on this wild goose chase, looking for this point in my life that maybe I had done something that had sparked these fears, or maybe I had some kind of hidden thing that I was repressing or something like that. So I was just giving so much attention to my obsessions, and I was really kind of feeding into them, almost giving into a compulsion of ruminating about them by looking at them under a microscope, when I really shouldn't have been doing that. I really should have just been doing ERP, which, you know, is the gold standard treatment for OCD. I should have been doing something like that instead of really just giving so much power to my obsessions, and then in turn so much time ruminating and compulsing. So I did that for a while, and of course I didn't see much success with that as far as managing my obsessions or my compulsions. I think maybe it helped with the symptoms of depression that I had to talk about some things not related to OCD in this talk therapy, but as far as OCD went, this did not help. In fact, you could probably go as far as saying it made it worse, because like I said, I was spending so much time obsessing about my obsessions and then doing the compulsions and examining that. It was just a mess. But after a while of doing that, I said, you know what, enough's enough. Something is not working here. I have to re-examine what I'm doing. And at that point, I realized that the things that people do to treat anxiety, since they weren't working for me, it wasn't just anxiety. It wasn't just depression. I wasn't getting better in the way that people talk about getting better when they go through therapy for those things. So I realized that, yeah, it's not that. It is OCD. And that's when I said, okay, I really have to do something about this. And so, of course, what I mean by this is the things that the therapist was talking about doing or prescribing for me to do weren't helping. It wasn't like I was getting, you know, ERP homework, something that would really help. It was just kind of meeting and talking about my feelings and, well, why do we feel this way? Why do you think this happened this way? Or why XYZ? I knew that the things that she was saying for me to do just weren't helping. And so although I've said before that I think I'm really lucky that I found out that I had OCD early, because I did, by the standard of when most people find out that they have OCD, I did find out very early. I was very lucky. But I still think that on the professional side and on the side of the patient, there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of misdiagnosis that happens, and just a lot of just general ignorance of what OCD really is, which leads to that misdiagnosis. And I think because I was listening to these professionals and maybe not so good at advocating for myself yet, I really second guessed what I was going through. I said, well, you know, these people know more than I do. They see this more. That they would know more about it than I do. But at the end of the day, you know yourself best. And like I said, if it feels like it just isn't right, it's worth looking into. So like I said, I had heard about ERP as the golden standard treatment for OCD. I'd learned about it a lot in my research when I was doing my many hours of Googling and looking on forums and reading about OCD. Of course, hey, listen, however you get there is how you get there. I found it through a compulsion. Maybe you'll find it through this video or some other video, but hey. So I decided, okay, ERP is really what I gotta do. And I went into it skeptical, I'll say, because I think so many of us have this feeling I've talked about before where it's like, well, I'm too sick, or it's not gonna work for me, I'm the special case, or maybe like I'm not sick enough, maybe that's really not what I should be doing. Just put all of those thoughts on the side for a minute and go for it. So if this sounds like you and ERP is something that you are ready to give a try, you can do that today through NOCD. You can go to NOCD.com or treatmyocd.com today, and you can talk to a professional that knows things about OCD, knows about the golden standard of treatment, knows about ERP, knows about all of those second guesses you have or those reservations you have, or knows about probably your journey to get there. They've heard it all. They've heard about how people have been misdiagnosed. They've heard about how people for years and years thought that they had something else or that they were suffering from some other illness or whatever the case. The therapists at NOCD have heard it all, and they are certified to help people with their OCD, to administer ERP, and to get you back on track to feeling better and feeling like yourself and living the life that you want to in spite of your OCD. I am always interested in hearing people's journeys and how they started here and then they went here and then they tried this and then they got this diagnosis, but then this doctor said this, and then finally they ended up on ERP or they ended up with the OCD diagnosis. So I would love to hear where you are in your journey, if any of this sounds like it happened to you, and just let's generate some conversation, because I always say the more that we talk about it, the more we are helping somebody else. And on that note, I'm gonna get going and I will see you guys next time. Bye.